The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
Now, before we get started, I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Lindsay Oberman serves as Associate Director of Clinical Research at the Rhode Island Consortium for Autism Research and Treatment, overseeing research activities as well as encouraging and facilitating new collaborations, grants, and manuscript submissions. Lindsay also serves as the Director of the Autism Spectrum Disorder and Neuroplasticity Program at Bradley University and the Scientific Director of the Clinical TMS Program at Rhode Island Hospital. Her research interests focus on getting a better understanding of what is happening in the brain of someone with ASD in hopes of applying these insights toward development of novel therapeutic interventions that target the causes of autism rather than simply treating the symptoms. You can type your questions into the questions section starting now and throughout the talk. We'll answer any that we can at the end. These webinars are made possible through generous donor support. If you'd like to contribute, please visit our website at autism.com. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Oberman.
All right, well, thank you so much for tuning in. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about our research on the use of TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, in autism. But I wanted to start with, there we go, with a brief review of what TMS is, what is transcranial magnetic stimulation. And like, say, a computer, there's lots of different devices and lots of different device makers, so they look a little bit different, but they all essentially are doing the same thing. So the device you see there is the NeuroStar device, which was the first to be FDA cleared for use in adult major depression, for the treatment of adult major depression, and is mostly a clinical device. So we don't have as many research NeuroStars out there, although the company is beginning to explore research device. A very common research device for TMS is called a MagStim TMS stimulator, and that's what you see there. And what's nice about this one is that you can pair it up with the individual's own MRI, so we can actually localize exactly where we're going to be stimulating in the brain. Another device that is on the market is one that is inside of a sort of helmet-looking device, and a lot of people say, oh, why wouldn't you do that? And this device is inside a helmet. The downside to having magnets inside of the helmet is that it does tend to be louder, and it reverberates, and the individual is sort of constrained to sitting in a certain position, whereas the MagStim is much more flexible. You can move it as the technician. You can move it all around as the person might need to move or adjust. There's also a commercially available TMS machine. All the previous machines I showed you are things that you would find in a hospital or in a clinic. This device that you see is a at-home device. It's FDA cleared for the treatment of migraines. So if an individual might feel a migraine coming on, they could get their device and put it up to the back of their head and prevent the migraine from coming. So that's a commercially available device. So how does it work? TMS, transcranial, means through the head or the cranium. Magnetic, meaning that it works through magnetic fields. And stimulation. And the reason why it stimulates is because of the magnetic field turning on and off very quickly. And unlike, for example, an MRI, which has a steady magnetic field, the TMS device, the magnetic field fluctuates very quickly. It turns on and off very quickly on the order of a fraction of a second. And because of a law in physics called Faraday's law, when a magnetic field turns on and off very quickly, it induces an electrical current. and the brain actually runs off of electricity. So we can actually place the TMS coil over an area, discharge it, and it will induce a action potential, or it will activate that part of the brain. And the reason why we know that it's activating that part of the brain is because we can actually see it when you place it over certain parts of the brain. And I actually included a video that I'll show you in just a minute that you can actually see how TMS is activating the motor cortex in the individual. But we can use TMS, and it was originally developed as a neuroscientific probe. It's a research tool to study brain functioning. So for example, if we want to learn about how the brain responds to a certain situation, or we want to study the excitability of the brain, how responsive is the brain, or how able is the brain to inhibit itself, we can use TMS to probe that, to actually induce an activity and see what happens. Single sessions of TMS, the effects are going to last seconds to minutes. They're very quick effects. So again, they're mostly used in research, not necessarily in treatment. But we can measure how the person's brain responds to a behavioral task, let's say. If we activate a certain area and then we have them do a task immediately after, do they do that task better than they did previously? Or we can activate a certain area and then look at their EEG or some other measure of brain functioning immediately after. As I said, it's used to probe excitability, inhibition, plasticity, or how easily a brain region can adapt or change or respond, and also what we call target engagement. So for example, if we think that a certain skill is a result of activity in a certain area, we can stimulate that area and see if we see a change in that skill. If we don't, then perhaps that skill is not being controlled by that part of the brain. So we use this for things like trying to find biomarkers. So if we say, let's say there's a drug that was given, that drug is supposed to change the functioning of an area of the brain, then we can actually target that area of the brain and see how it's changed in its responsivity. We can also start to individualize treatment. So we can say, well, we're only going to give this treatment if the person shows an abnormality in the functioning of this part of the brain. So here's the video I referred to, and again, you should have received this ahead of time, but I'll go ahead and play it for you again. And it's going to show somebody receiving TMS to their motor cortex. So you'll watch as the different parts of her body moves in response to the stimulation. And the headband that she's wearing is the headband that we can then link up to her own individual MRI. And you'll also see that she has some sensors on her hand, and that's measuring how the different muscles and how they're moving. So I'll go ahead and play that for you.
Hi, Recon. Welcome to our laboratory. Today we're going to show you how the transcranial magnetic stimulator works. So first thing, Yoshi's going to put the magnetic coil over top of the area of my motor cortex that's responsible for the muscles of my hand and forearm. Once she's there, she's going to deliver a magnetic pulse. Oh, and you probably saw my arm twitch there. And we can also see this response over here on the oscilloscope because we've measured it using the EMG electrodes over the muscles of my hand and forearm. Now what we're going to do is move that magnetic coil over the span of my motor cortex from one side all the way over to the next. And what you'll see is muscles slowly recruited from my hand up to my elbow, shoulder, right leg. And after she switches hemispheres, we'll see some of the left leg come in and then down the muscles of my left arm. So here we go. So right hand, little bit of elbow, some shoulder and leg, still right leg, little response in my left leg there, we switched hemispheres, elbow, and left hand. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. All right. So I should also say here that you can feel when the magnetic field discharges. It feels like somebody's flicking your head, but it does not hurt. And the movement that you saw in the body is activating the primary motor cortex in the same way that you would if you voluntarily were to move the different parts of your body. So one protocol, there's different uses, as I said, for TMS, and there's different protocols. So one protocol that I know I've used to study inhibition in autism and also in other disorders like epilepsy, where we're interested in increasing inhibitory control, is called paired pulse TMS. And this is essentially, we put in pairs of pulses of TMS. So instead of just a single pulse that's going to activate the motor cortex and make the person twitch, we put two pulses in a row. And depending on the interpulse interval, the time in between the two pulses, we can actually specifically study different types of inhibitory mechanisms. So if you've ever heard of the term GABA, this is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in your brain, and we can actually study how well GABA is engaged in the brain by putting in these pairs of pulses. And what we found in an early study that we did was that there's a lot of, we call heterogeneity, a lot of variability within individuals with ASD. So some of them have very typical, a good deal of inhibition, and some individuals, in fact, have what we call paradoxical facilitation. They have the opposite response. So when GABA is engaged, they actually have a greater responsivity of their brain. And so we believe that there is sort of this variability within the population, that some individuals with ASD may show a paradoxical response, that their GABA system may be excitatory, or they may have less inhibition than they should. And in this graph, the yellow bars are the healthy, typically developing individuals that were the controls for the individuals with ASD. Another protocol that is often used both in research and also beginning to be used in therapeutic applications of TMS is called Theta burst stimulation. And this protocol was actually designed to mimic what the brain does when it's learning and when it's adapting to its environment. And so what we're doing is sort of artificially putting in that same pattern of activity to try to enhance the learning of that brain area. And so the protocol basically starts out very similar to what you saw previously, where we put in a single pulse of TMS, and we can measure how much the person twitches, for example, if they're in the if we're in the motor cortex. We then put in a very short intervention protocol. So it's very short, but there's a lot of pulses in that time period. So in the continuous form, which is on the top there, we put in bursts of 3 pulses every 200 milliseconds. So it's 5 times per second we put in bursts of pulses. So in 40 seconds of that protocol, we actually put in 600 pulses over the course of 40 seconds. In the intermittent data burst protocol, which is in the bottom there, we take breaks every 2 seconds. So we go 2 seconds on, 8 seconds off, 2 seconds on, 8 seconds off. And in that intermittent protocol, it takes about 3 minutes to put in around 600 pulses. So it's the same number of pulses, but it takes longer in the intermittent because we take breaks. And then we measure the effect that short intervention has on the responsiveness of that brain area. And so if we assume that a certain individual is at their own baseline, whatever amount that their finger, again, if we're over motor cortex, is twitching, that's their baseline level. And then we can put in this continuous theta burst protocol. And what's going to happen is actually the area of the brain is going to become suppressed. It's going to respond less than it did before you put in that 40-second protocol. And the effect actually lasts about a half an hour to 40 minutes. So 40 seconds of a protocol, the effects last on the order of 30 minutes. And during those 30 minutes, we can measure all sorts of things related to how that brain area is functioning. The intermittent version of the protocol actually has the opposite effect. So when you put 2 seconds on, 8 seconds off, and you take these breaks, what you'll see is actually a facilitation. The person's twitching more. Their twitches are larger than they were at baseline. And again, it takes about 30 to 40 minutes. Now, there is some variability between people. So some people, you put in that continuous theta burst and they facilitate. And I'll show you that in just a few minutes. We see that more often in individuals with ASD, that they have sort of, again, this paradoxical response from what we would expect. And so we did our original study, we published in 2012. This was in adults with ASD. And what we found was that in our typically developing healthy controls, again, adults, we see exactly what we expected. The continuous version of the theta burst protocol resulted in a suppression of responses, and the intermittent resulted in a facilitation of the responses for, again, around 30 to 40 minutes. And those error bars you're seeing, the bars on each dot, is the variability across participants. So there is a difference across participants. Some people are back in 20 minutes. Some people, the effects last 40, 50 minutes. It does vary, but overall, on average, it's pretty reliable. And then we did the same thing with 20 individuals, again, adults with ASD. These were adults without any kind of intellectual disability. And what we saw was that the effects lasted much, much longer. They were in the same direction, the expected direction, but they were lasting much longer. And so if you compare the responsiveness of the ASD individuals to those of the healthy typical controls, then you see that it's almost double to triple the duration of the responsiveness. So then what we did was we took a whole separate group of individuals and we did the same thing, but we then afterwards tried to blindly categorize individuals as having ASD or not, based simply on whether they were back to their baseline at 40 minutes. Because in our original study, that was the time point where the groups were most different. And what we found is that we could actually very reliably categorize individuals as either having ASD or were neurotypically developing, and with pretty good sensitivity and specificity. Now, the original study was done in adults, so we then said, okay, what's going on in children? And in the original study, we did not have any healthy, typically developing children. We are actually collecting that data right now, so stay tuned for whether this is typical or atypical in terms of development. But what we did see was that there was a trajectory, that the individuals with ASD were not at that longer duration that characterized the adults until 16, 17, 18 years old. And what was very interesting here, and we're waiting for the data from a larger study to really see whether this is a linear change from younger to older, or if in fact there's something going on at puberty. So if you look there, right at the age of when, and these were all boys, I should say, when the boys were presumably going through puberty around 13, 14, 15 years old, they were sort of, that was the breaking point where we saw this change into the longer duration. So, you know, is it really a linear transformation, or is there something that's happening at puberty that really is a sudden shift in the excitability or plasticity of the brain? We're still waiting on larger sample to really tease that apart. As I said before, we had some individuals that had a paradoxical facilitation, that the response to this protocol, the one that was supposed to inhibit or suppress activity, was actually to facilitate. And we saw this mostly in the younger children. Again, we did not see this in the adults. And so what we're starting to think is perhaps, again, this is a developmental thing that may be changing right around puberty. But again, we're waiting on a larger sample to really tease that apart. At the other end of the age spectrum, we're also looking at aging, and if this longer duration or bigger change in response to the protocol actually is maintained in adulthood. Because what we see actually in older individuals with, for example, Alzheimer's, is that they have a very, very little responsivity to this protocol. And so one might argue that if individuals with ASD are starting out at a higher plasticity or higher response to this protocol, and they have the same trajectory of decline over age, which all of us are declining at a very slow rate, but still declining over the age range, that they would be relatively protected against developing Alzheimer's. And we have very few data points in the older 75, 80-year-olds with ASD. And so it's hard to say at this point, but it does look like the trajectory is heading at the same rate in the ASD group as in the typically developing individuals. So just to summarize from a research perspective, how we can use these protocols to understand more about the brain of individuals with ASD and how it develops, and also over the age span, what we found is that there is a great amount of heterogeneity. There's a lot of variability, both in terms of the inhibition and in terms of the plasticity. And this can speak to perhaps different mechanisms of action, different underlying causes of some of the behavioral symptoms. But overall, as a group, we found that individuals with ASD had a longer lasting response to the plasticity protocol, or the protocol that is supposed to change or adapt the functioning of that brain area. And that was a reliable finding across two different adult groups. But we definitely need to consider things like development and aging effects, and we need larger samples and younger samples, pediatric samples, to really delve into whether that's true across the age span. We are still pursuing this line of research. We have ongoing studies where we're looking at what is the relationship between some of these measures and the behavioral symptoms. How may that be mediated by changes in brain functioning and the connectivity within the brain? So what we think is going on is these sort of very low-level inhibitory control, plasticity measures, which are very sort of at the level of synapses and individual neurons, that developmentally that's going to affect circuits and how they are functionally connected and how they function as a group. And then that is what then is going to mediate the behavioral phenotype. And so we're looking within an individual how these different measures then contribute to the specific symptoms. We're also looking at the reliability of these measures. Can we be using them as endpoints or outcome measures for clinical trials, for example? If somebody has a specific pattern that is unique to them, that is reliable, that we can measure across time points. And also inter-individual reliability. So is this really a ASD characteristic, or is it only present in high-functioning individuals or individuals without intellectual disability? Is it something that we see across development? Is there an effect of puberty? As I said, we're getting larger samples, more variable samples, individuals with intellectual disability and without, to try to gauge all of these different measures. What I think a lot of people are very interested in is, can these different protocols be used to develop new therapeutic interventions? So can we really tap into this ability of the brain to change and adapt and modulate, and can we actually modulate regions of the brain that are related to symptoms and begin to improve those symptoms, or at least improve the functioning of those brain areas? The challenge here is, what is your target? So all the time I get phone calls and say, what's the TMS protocol for ASD? And I said, well, there isn't really one protocol, because there isn't really one brain area that is really ASD all in one brain area. So as many of you are probably aware, autism spectrum disorders are a spectrum. So some individuals may show aspects of ADHD or hyperactivity or impulsivity. Other people may show anxiety. Other people may have irritability or aggression. And the different types of protocols that you would want to use for all of these different types of symptoms will vary. And so there isn't really one protocol or one area that we can stimulate and then improve all of these behaviors all at once. But what we can do is start to hone in on specific symptoms. And so this is what we did in an early study, where we were trying to target people's ability to mimic. And the reason for that is there's a lot of data to suggest that that underlies some skills in terms of empathy, of emotions. And so what we did was we took a task, which I developed many years ago in graduate school, where we would record facial muscles from the participant, and we would show them pictures of different facial expressions. And then we would see if there was spontaneous mimicry of the participant when they're watching these facial expressions. And what we found was that in a typically developing individual, and these were in children, there was an automatic spontaneous mimicry response that occurred approximately 1 second after they viewed a facial expression. And it was consistent with the muscle of the facial expression that they were looking at. And what we found was that in individuals with ASD, they also showed a mimicry response, but that response was delayed. But it was about the same. It was a little bit more diffuse, so there wasn't as sharp of a peak there. But we did see the mimicry response. It was just delayed by a couple hundred milliseconds, which actually in the whole scheme of things of a brain response is actually very delayed, and so could be affecting some of their behaviors. And so what we then did was we stimulated a part of the brain that was involved, or we believed to be involved, in this automatic mimicry response. This was the response, and this was actually now in adults with ASD. What we found was something very similar to our previous finding, was that individuals with ASD showed a slightly delayed peak. And then after a single session of stimulation to this brain area, we actually shifted the peak. We made it go earlier, quicker, after just a single session. And these measures were taken immediately following the stimulation protocol. Now, after a single session, it did not actually totally get us all the way to what we saw in our typically developing individuals. Again, these were all adults now. So perhaps in order to be sort of a therapeutic response, we would need to do more than one session. But this was quite promising, and this is actually something that has gotten a lot of publicity, especially recently. So you may have seen or heard about a recent book that was published by one of our participants in the study, where he noticed something very outwardly evident to him after that stimulation to that area. And the change was so great in this individual that he decided to write a book about it, a memoir about it. And it actually extended beyond just looking at facial expressions on a computer screen, but into how he was able to interact with others in a social domain. Now, we did see this type of change in others, although I would say that his response was quite unique in that it was able to be maintained by him for a longer duration than any other participant. So we have some ideas related to perhaps his own self-insight, as well as the situation that he was in at the time, where he was participating in the study, and then he also, again, had written a book, so he was going on a book tour and was constantly talking about his experience, other people's experiences, relating to others that may have been able to maintain the effect longer than what we saw in other participants. There is quite, unfortunately, a slow pipeline to bringing these types of therapies to be something that you could receive clinically in the outside. So again, I get calls all the time where people say, I heard about this, I read it in the book, or I heard about it on the TV show or on a radio, and you know, where can I get this for my child? And I say, unfortunately, right now, we're really not at a point where we know where should we stimulate, if it's safe or tolerable or even effective in children versus adults. And what is the variability? We did see that in all of our studies that some of these changes are really profound in some individuals, and others say that they didn't see any change. And so we're trying to tease apart what is it about the individuals that did see the change, and how can we really optimize these protocols. So as I said, we're not really targeting ASD as a whole one thing, but rather trying to pick specific symptoms that impact people's quality of life, and also has been shown to be modifiable. So if the brain region or circuit that we think underlies this ability is something that's so diffuse or it's really deep in the brain, it's not something that we're going to be able to modify with TMS. And so we're trying to really tease apart what are modifiable targets, what are not, and what will have the most impact. So some of the behavioral domains that we're really looking into right now are things like social communication, perspective taking, executive functioning, irritability, also depression. As I said, depression is already FDA cleared for an adult major depression. It's currently being studied as part of a very large-scale trial in adolescents with major depression, and we recognize that depression is also a big problem in the ASD community. So it could the standard depression protocol work for individuals with ASD and depression? It's something that we're currently looking into. We have to then identify a brain network or mechanism. So as I said, maybe individuals with ASD have depression, but maybe their depression isn't caused by the same network or dysfunction that we see in major depression. And so just because a similar behavior shows up doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to target the same area. And so we want to make sure that whatever brain region has been associated with that behavioral target in ASD. And so a couple different brain targets that have been trialed. One is called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the same region that has been targeted in depression that we're also looking at to see if it may be effective in irritability. Also an area called the IFG, or inferior frontal gyrus. That's the region that we targeted for the empathy or the mimicry study. And also the posterior STS, or superior temporal sulcus, the back of the head, has been implicated in things like perspective taking and visual processing, social visual processing. And so we are starting to look into that and studying if modulating that in ASD may lead to an improvement in those types of symptoms. So we also want to make sure that we know when we're modifying it, that it's actually modifying it in the correct direction. So as I said, protocols that we think should be suppressing sometimes facilitate in individuals with ASD. So we have to figure out what is the right protocol that will shift the activity in that area in the correct direction. And sometimes it's more complicated than just simply choosing a specific protocol that for everybody we think is going to do the same thing, which we know, again, is not the case. We then have to choose participants who have those specific symptoms. So not everybody in ASD has exactly the same symptoms. So we want to, again, design studies that are targeted to those specific symptoms rather than just including everybody with ASD. Previous studies that did include everybody with ASD really just didn't end up with anything significant because perhaps you're modulating a circuit that in that individual is not impaired or is not dysfunctional. And then we have to then do it in a blind way. We see a huge amount of placebo effects. And so we want to make sure that these effects are not simply that the parents are really, really looking for some improvement, or the individual themselves are having this sort of placebo effect. And that's where we run into a little bit of trouble with anecdotal reports, because we can't really rely on those as data, because the person may just believe that they're getting better, but we can do sort of more objective measures that show, no, actually they're not doing as well as they think they may be. So there's these challenges. We have to measure things in a very objective way using brain imaging and targeted ways to really study what is going on at the level of the brain. We want to have a developmental perspective to make sure that whatever we're developing is effective or tolerable for young children as well as in adults. And that also requires a large sample sizes. So we're constantly looking for more participants to be enrolled in our studies. So we make sure to really cover the wide variety of symptoms and behaviors. So try to finish up a little early to allow for questions, but I just wanted to acknowledge that these studies were not all done simply by me alone. I have a lot of collaborators, both where I am now, which is at Bradley Hospital and Brown University, as well as in my previous work with at Beth Israel Hospital and Children's Hospital in Boston. And this work is funded by a number of both private foundations as well as National Institutes of Health. So thank you, and thank all our participants for participating in our research. And I'm now very happy to answer whatever questions or comments or concerns you might have.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that excellent presentation. For everybody who's listening, we're going to have that presentation online later today. So if you'd like to review the slides or go back and listen to different parts of it, we'll have it on our website at ariconference.com. We'll start in. We've got a lot of questions, so I'll start reading some of these to you. One of the first ones was talking about, this person's asking about relationships between ophthalmology and TMS, so any insights about connections between the visual cortex and the use of this treatment?
So if you were looking to modify visual symptoms or visual behaviors, you could certainly place the coil over the occipital lobe or the visual area of the brain if you're looking to target those types of symptoms. So if the deficits are cortical, if the deficits are related to a brain processing of visual information, then yes, we can target those brain regions as well as we could any other brain regions, but we certainly wouldn't be able to stimulate the eyes or any kind of ocular nerves. But if it is cortical, then you could certainly target that.
I'm getting a lot of questions from people who are wondering about studies that they can enroll in. Are there studies that are open right now or studies that might be coming up? Where would they get information?
Yeah, so I probably should have put my email. I'm sorry. I can put, if you don't have it, I can put it on, I don't know, can I send out an email later?
Yeah, we'll do a follow-up email afterwards. So if you'd like me to share it, I can. Yep.
Yes, I'm happy to send it, or if you Google my name, you'll probably find me. And I'm waiting for in 5 minutes, like a bunch of emails coming in. But I'm more than happy to talk to you about the studies that we have going on and whether you or your child may be eligible. Most of the studies, I should say, are not what I would call therapeutic trials. So they are, again, research studies where we'll maybe stimulate using 1 or 2 sessions, and we're really trying to just probe different protocols and see what the change might be in the short term. And the reason for that is so that we make sure that whatever symptom or whatever target we're trying to make better, we actually shift in the correct direction, because again, we're not at a point yet that we can predict who's going to be that paradoxical facilitator or a person who's going to have a different response to it, and we'd rather have something that is a good change that is short-lived, that then we can say, okay, well, then we know that this person would be a good responder for a later trial, then have somebody come out, undergo many, many sessions, and then have an effect that is a negative effect that may last a long time. So right now, we do have a number of studies that are ongoing, but most of them, as I said, are not at the stage where they would be therapeutic trials. And so depending on where you live or your ability to come out to Rhode Island would probably limit what you're interested in participating in, but we're more than happy to tell you about the studies that we have going on.
Okay, great. The next question, I know you mentioned the book by John Elder Robison, and a lot of people are asking about the benefit of a treatment that, at least in the clinic, lasts just a short time. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the sustained out-of-office results that people see or may see depending on their susceptibility to treatment?
So what we believe is that that the protocols that we're using right now do not have a long-lasting effect, and only perhaps in the situation where the effect was probably from us very short acting, but he himself was able to maintain it, and so. Even with John, we did not put in a therapeutic protocol. We put in a single session. And so why, again, he was able to maintain it when others were not. We have some theories, but we don't know exactly. And so the studies that we're doing right now, again, there's not, I don't want to mislead. I don't want to suggest that there is any potential for a long-term change based on those studies. That being said, we would love to be conducting studies where we are combining TMS with perhaps behavioral therapies or tying things together to make it a more long-lasting effect. We just haven't been able to secure funding for those types of studies yet.
Okay, the next question is about individuals who are nonverbal. Have you done studies with anybody with that phenotype, and what did you see?
So we have started, and the only study that we've done so far was simply a tolerability study, and what we found is that the majority of individuals who are nonverbal have not been able to tolerate the stimulation. As you saw in some of those pictures, in order to do the study, even though the protocol is quite short, 40 seconds, we need them to be able to sit still for those 40 seconds. We need them to be able to allow us to place this coil on top of their head. The coil does, again, emit a sensory sensation that feels like somebody's flicking your head, and it makes a loud clicking noise. We do give earphones or earplugs that dampens down the sound a little bit, but what we found is that oftentimes with the nonverbal symptoms, we also often find that these individuals show hypersensitivity or hyperreactivity to sensory stimuli. Not everybody, and we certainly have had success in the tolerability, but I would say the vast majority of individuals that we've tried in this just initial study, which was simply on tolerability, have not been able to tolerate the TMS. So far we have not been, if the question is, could we get people who are nonverbal to be able to speak? I have not been able to do that or see that in my experience yet.
All right. People are asking about access to treatment through, I guess, through commercial centers or through physicians who are using this. So does that exist? Where would somebody find a provider if they're trying to find it, outside of the study research community?
So there are outside providers who would be more than happy to take your money and apply a TMS protocol to you or your child's brain. I do not recommend that. I don't think we're at a point where we even know what protocol may be safe, especially in children. And the study, when we do studies, they're all under very strict regulatory oversight, that we have people keeping an eye, making sure that what we're doing is safe, and that we stick to the protocol. There are centers, I won't lie, there are plenty of centers that would be more than happy to take your money, but I just don't, personally, as a researcher, as a parent, I don't think that we're at a point where that I would recommend for you to do that.
Okay, and leading from that question, somebody was asking how this is different from neurofeedback. So what's the difference between TMS and that protocol?
So that's an excellent question, and it's actually it's similar, but it's actually almost opposite. So in neurofeedback, what you're doing is you are feeding back the brain activity, usually through an EEG, to the individual, and then the individual with their behavior is able to then control or try to control their brain activity. So what we're doing with TMS is actually inputting a stimulation into the brain that is then going to be affecting behavior. So instead of requiring the individual to need to concentrate or do a certain task or be able to pay attention or do any of that, the person can just sit there. They are somewhat of a passive player when we actually are putting in the brain stimulation. And so although arguably the effects may be variable depending on how much they are paying attention to it. So the TMS, we are actually putting in activity into the brain and measuring behavior, whereas neurofeedback, the individual is changing their behavior to affect the brain.
Okay, and so one last question in related sort of areas. Somebody was asking about craniosacral therapy. So do you know anything about that as a treatment or how that relates to any of these other issues?
I don't. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that type of treatment.
Not familiar with that one. Okay,
yeah,
so another question that we got, people were asking about, I know you touched on lifespan, how responsive is, I'm not saying that right, how people respond differently throughout the lifespan in pediatric population versus teens and then adulthood. So I did get quite a few questions from people with adult loved ones in their families, and they're wondering about how effective and responsive this is in the adult population. I know you touched on it. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you've seen, and then also about specific areas of improvement that might be potential, like sleep problems or other things that might be improved through this.
Yeah, so we do know that the brain is plastic throughout the lifespan, so we can definitely modulate brain activity in adults. And related to specific symptoms, again, we focused on certain symptoms that we've been able to secure funding for, to do research and do studies on. But sleep, for me, I have not specifically done any studies on sleep in autism, although it's certainly, I recognize it's a problem, but it related to TMS or how it might be able to be effective in autism. I've not done any studies or heard about any studies ongoing on that. That being said, TMS is being used in many research labs for many, many different behavioral, neurological, psychiatric disorders. And so, you know, the question then just becomes, are the sleep problems in autism similar to a sleep problem in, say, depression? Or is it similar to, is the anxiety seen in autism similar to anxiety seen in generalized anxiety disorder? And so, you know, what we need to start to pull apart is just because symptoms may be similar doesn't mean the same circuits or brain regions or protocols should be used in those individuals. So again, we're really at the infancy of our understanding of, first of all, the brain in individuals with ASD, across the lifespan in children, in adults, how it changes, and then, you know, what TMS protocols would be effective to treat all of these different aspects of autism. So that's one of the reasons also I would suggest, you know, to not jump to a commercial treatment before we really understand more about what is it that TMS is doing and how can it be developed as a treatment in ASD.
Okay, so touching on that, in your protocols, obviously you're very conscientious about safety issues. Are there safety issues that people may want to consider, or what are areas of vulnerability that concern you when you write your studies?
Yes, so the major serious side effect that has been induced with TMS is a risk of seizure. In somebody who is not seizure prone, so they've never had a seizure, they don't have a first degree relative, they're not on medications that would induce a seizure, the risk of inducing a seizure with TMS is approximately 1 in 3,000. It is very, very rare. However, it has happened. So that is the most serious but very, very rare thing to consider. Much more often, say 10 to 15% of individuals we see say that TMS gives them a headache. Again, you're usually placing a reasonably heavy coil on top of somebody's head, flicking, making a loud noise, requiring that they sit in a position for the research studies for a longer period of time often, and so that could be contributing towards the headache. We also see risk of ringing in the ears, so we always give people earplugs to make sure that the noise isn't too loud for them. Depending on where you are stimulating, you can overstimulate an area or stimulate an area that is perhaps not exactly the right area for that person. And so what we've seen is, for example, as people are being treated for depression, for example, some individuals will show a manic response. So they'll be sort of shifted too far over. And so you have to be sort of careful about changing behavior and monitoring as you are shifting behavior. It's again continuing to shift in the same direction or positive direction, and that it's not leading to other changes in behavior that may be adverse.
Okay, and relating, I mean, obviously a lot of your focus has been on autism, but has there been any investigation of like ADD or ADHD related to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk about it today, but I do also have several studies where we're studying ADD and ADHD, and specifically related to impulsive behavior and attention. So we do have ongoing studies in that as well, and that's even, I would say, less known or less studied using TMS than in autism. But again, beginning to be studied and looked at and see any of these behaviors. Again, if you can figure out what is the brain target and can that brain target be modulated, and if you can modulate it, does that improve behavior? There's a huge wide variety of potential uses for TMS. In other labs and other studies, they look at TMS in diabetes, in Parkinson's, in Alzheimer's, in eating disorders, and addiction. So there's lots of different uses. It's just a matter of so many hours in the day and so many studies that can be run, but also, you know, what is your target and what is it something that can be modified?
Okay, and has there been any investigation where they've looked at people who've had concussions or head injuries with TMS?
Yes. So there is that line of research as well.
Okay, that's not your area.
That's not my
research.
area, though. Yes.
Yeah, but that's research that people could look out there. Okay, so maybe one last question here. People were asking about when you were doing these studies, were all of the participants free of medication, or were some of them on medications? And would that impact the results if they were on any kind of like neuropsych medications or those types of things?
Yes, it definitely could impact the results, and some of them were. It depends on the study. Again, when we look at, we sort of balance the safety of keeping somebody on the drug versus the safety of taking somebody off of a drug. And so, and also how it might impact the data and the results. So we always consider that when we look at the data and the results, we always consider that in terms of our analyses. But it depends on the study. I would say some studies we say, you know, certainly related to safety, there's certain drugs that may increase seizure risk, and so we would say that those people would not be eligible. For certain studies that we're not sure whether it would benefit them. But in other drugs and other studies, you know, we would allow certain meds to be maintained.